Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host. We are now in September. The light has changed. The air is changing. It's cooling down, although there's some storms in the Atlantic. And you feel like students are back and the fall has begun. Way back in June, I sat down with David Dixon, who is a senior planner at Stantec. He's somebody I've known for well over a decade now, and we sat down and we talked about everything that he's been working on and thinking about for quite some time. Turns out it took me quite a while to get that video edited, and it's now finally edited. And what you're going to see here is my conversation with David Dixon from back in June of this year. You'll notice that there are some outtakes where I'm asking a question, but I'm off camera. That's because the camera I set up to have the shot of me didn't work very well. So we had to just go with the main camera. So that explains why I'm off camera in all my questioning. I hope you enjoy the conversation. It's great to see you all back. And we look forward to producing many more unplans for the fall and this upcoming year on any topics that we find interesting, but also hopefully some that you find interesting, and you should feel free to share those with me. But for now, please enjoy this episode with David Dixon.
Okay, and because you asked me to talk about something interesting, I thought I would talk about the joy of sex. Oops, sorry, it's actually the joy of density.
Okay.
Sorry
to disappoint.
Yeah, so am I. All right, so here we are at the joy of density, and I'm going to cover 4 key points. First of all, why should we be talking about walkable density as opposed to simple density? Why should we talk about walkable density now, and particularly to spur a new era of downtown opportunities for cities and suburbs alike with the lessons we've learned from the pandemic? How to build a walkable density paradigm to replace maybe the simple paradigm that density holds now. And finally, some examples of putting walkable density to work, case studies where at the right density has really made a difference.
All right, so I know you're going to literally walk us through all this stuff. Yeah. The first questions may not be your first slide, so you go where you want to go with this. Walkable versus simple density.
Walkable, thank you, that's a great question. And the first slide just happens to be a quote that I heard from somebody whose name I have long forgotten, but he was a fellow at the ULI who used to say, or said for many years, density with amenity is community, without amenity is crowding. This walkable is amenity. When I go out and talk to folks in neighborhoods, in downtowns, in suburbs and cities alike, the number one thing they want is for their neighbors to be more walkable, for places to walk to, for walkable places that allow them to run into neighbors. Walkable lands in every sentence. And this talk will be about the kind of density that delivers that kind of amenity, creates walkable places. The pandemic has taught us a couple of important lessons. Let me reframe that. The pandemic has accelerated trends that have taught us a couple of important lessons. Probably the clearest lesson as it relates to how we plan, develop, build our communities is that while the trend toward hybrid work actually goes back at least 2 decades, if not more, the pandemic really accelerated that trend and made it much more visible. First of all, I hope everybody listening knows that the pandemic, its severity correlated not with density, but with poverty. And among the byproducts was not only a recognition that the era of office development driving the resurgence and prosperity of downtowns and being the tool that we could use in cities to create new suburban downtowns is over. It also taught us a number of other lessons that are worth mentioning. One is how much we value community. the chance to experience community, I should say. I live in a neighborhood in Boston called the South End, where nothing is more jealously guarded than the number of on-street parking spaces and keeping that at a maximum. And I have found it fascinating that folks were willing to give up their parking spaces for outdoor dining as the pandemic proceeded, and restaurants discovered that. And that as the pandemic has receded in importance, people are continue to be willing to give up parking spaces to have those outdoor tables and that outdoor dining, because that to them to us is visible community, and it's the symbol of our ability to enjoy each other in our neighborhood. Expect very little investment in any net new office space, new office buildings for a very long time. We've got a big supply, particularly in the suburb, because the office demand has collapsed to a much greater extent in suburbs than it has in cities, because the growth in our economy is coming and our therefore net new jobs that are we're looking for staff have shifted increasingly towards the knowledge economy, innovation, folks with more education. They particularly prefer living and working in urban places. However, studies by PwC, by the Center City, Philadelphia Center City Partnership clearly demonstrate that we are in for a very long period of reduced occupancy in our offices, therefore reduced demand for office space, and we're going to have a lot of empty office space to reuse, to fill up for probably at least the next 2 decades. Nothing supports renewed life on our downtown streets more than downtown housing as opposed to office. And what I'm now going to jump into is something I love to call the new norm, which talks about the changes to our demographics, to our economy, that basically suggest going forward, it doesn't actually, well, of course it matters that our office economy, the way we work has changed so much and the impacts on our office economy, but we are actually entering a period of unprecedented opportunity for downtowns in cities and suburbs alike, and actually neighborhood centers, because of the unprecedented demand to live in walkable mixed-use environments based on demographic change. If it were not for immigration, I don't mean to touch a tough political issue,
that's all right.
The U.S. workforce would shrink over the next 20 years. Right. That is the same kind of issue that we worry about when we talk about Japan and other countries, in terms of it is very hard to grow an economy without a growing workforce.
And is that across sectors? So that's manual labor, service jobs,
all
high tech,
yes,
everything.
Yeah. There are shortages no matter where you look. The shortages actually are most severe when you're looking for educated workers and some college education or more, and 90+% of net new jobs in the next 20 years are going to require some higher education. We have a shortage of these folks now. We're going to have a severe shortage going forward, and therefore the companies, 90+% of net new jobs means this is where economic growth is occurring. The companies that produce this economic growth, create the jobs and make the investment, are going where this talent, as they refer to it, wants to live and therefore work, play, and everything else. And where do these folks want to live? In mixed-use, walkable environments. That could be in small cities. It can be in suburbs as we redevelop malls, et cetera. They are particularly attracted to urban downtowns.
So here's a question on that.
Yes.
When you say mixed-use walkable environments, are these existing environments, so they already exist, or could they be anywhere? Could it be?
Great question. All your questions are great. The advantage that downtowns have is those environments already exist. Suburbs can create them in places like failing malls and failing strip centers. Right. But this is where cities have a real advantage. One of the things to note is that just about every advanced country or developed economy in the world is facing a growing shortage of skilled and educated labor. U.S. Basically current data currently suggests that 40% of companies with 10 or more employees, most of these being in the knowledge economy, cannot find as much as the workforce they need. The Googles and Amazons of the world, just like law firms, accountants and others,
Right.
Don't expect more than maybe 60% of their workforce to be in the office at any point in time. They actually tell us that makes them care more about place, where their offices, where their company is located, because they want that workforce, if they're not in the office, in the workplace, living within 5 minutes, if they can, a 5-minute walk of that workplace, and of each other.
But now I'm going to push in a slightly different direction. But
Sure.
how does that fact relate to this shrinking of the downtown market? So if the Googles want their people to live close to where they're working, but downtown office is disappearing. So I've heard, at least anecdotally, that in places like Kendall Square, a lot of these big players are actually shutting up shop, or they just don't have the need for the square footage.
That's actually interesting here that in Kendall Square, because actually during the pandemic...
It's anecdotal, by the way.
Okay.
But
during the pandemic, particularly sort of leading edge of innovation, the sort of Googles and Amazons of the world have invested billions of dollars in downtown buying vacant office buildings. In New York, I've forgotten Google, I forgot it was Google or not, bought the Chelsea Market, which was this really cool mixed-use development. In Calgary, I've looked at Calgary, at Edmonton, Cincinnati. There are quite a number of cities where those investments are moving in because they've got to go where their talent wants to live. If they want to have a chance to have that talent living within 5 minutes of where they work and with each other. And why do they want the talent living within 5 minutes of each other or work? A, they're much more likely to stay with that company, to identify with it. B, the primary driver for innovation productivity, this we learned from working with the largest innovation cluster in Canada, which is called Canada North, outside of Ottawa, is what they call creative collisions, unplanned meetings that people who work for different companies have with each other, informal meetings, collisions, because it is out of these informal, unplanned meetings, and you just cannot have an unplanned Zoom meeting no matter how hard you try,
Right.
come
Good
the
point.
new ideas that nobody had when they walked into the meeting, but everybody leaves with, that actually feed the supply of ideas that actually turn into commercializable, what's the term I want to use? Products for innovation companies. So if you think of this as a funnel, a lot of ideas have to be coming in to be analyzed, studied, reviewed, and turned into a trickle that come out that these companies can actually sell and make money from. When the supply is not coming in because the creative collisions aren't happening, the trickle dries up, if you see what I'm saying. Hence, place and place-based thinking and planning, hence a downtown as opposed to a Wi-Fi network, have become more important over the pandemic.
Well, I know you've got more slides, but how, given that fact, and let's call it a fact, how does that play in the larger, you mentioned Cincinnati. I'm curious how that relates to the Cincinnatis of the world, the Omaha, Nebraskas, the Kansas City, Kansases, as opposed to the Bostons, the New Yorks, the San Franciscos, et cetera. Is this true across the board, if you will?
A, yes, and B, in fact, it's more important for those cities because if you want a future, an economic future for your region, and I'm speaking broadly and in headlines, and I'm going to talk about equity in a few minutes because people must begin to think this all sounds very elitist, and it is so far. If you want a real, economic growth is coming from our knowledge economy. If you want your share of that, You need to be the kind of place that the talent that attracts these jobs and investments wants to come to. If you aren't, your ability to grow your economy, to grow economic opportunity for your community is severely limited. We've been doing a lot of work in Buffalo, New York. It's a city I find just fascinating. Buffalo,
presumably had a heyday at some point.
Oh boy, did it have a heyday in about 1950.
Right.
One of the real coming cities of America. Lost its manufacturing base, et cetera, is really rebuilding itself around a knowledge economy. And this is around its walkability, its quality of life. It has great neighborhoods. But one of the things that the city has done a lot of research in is how do these jobs benefit all the other folks who live in Buffalo who don't have a college degree. And they've determined that each new knowledge industry job creates 5 other jobs. Every city and region in the U.S. needs to invest much more in really robust workforce readiness programs. That means you can dangle all the jobs and education opportunities you want in front of a single parent, and they can't do a thing about it unless you also offer daycare. Somebody's been in jail. They could be brilliant. They could have rehabilitated themselves. They can't get a job unless somebody cures their record, so to speak. We've got to unlock the opportunity for the full spectrum of who we are as a society to come into our knowledge economy if we're going to grow our economy and economic opportunity for virtually every city and region. And here is Pierre Trudeau and President Obama toasting each other at Canada North. I mentioned it's the largest retail innovation cluster in Canada, at the one beer brewery in Canada North. Canada North was a tech park that was spread out over hundreds of acres. We were actually hired to say, how do we turn this into an innovation district so that your employees won't all move to Seattle or Boston or companies there. And that was actually all about adding thousands of units of housing that would support lively streets and about 5 more breweries, because that was what these companies needed. They can find space. They can pay for any space they want. It's the creating an infrastructure, an innovation ecosystem that is what downtowns with enough housing and enough density, enough critical mass are really good at, that attracts innovation and our knowledge economy. Is that making sense?
It does make sense, and it makes me think of a random thought that in one way is obvious, but it's the first time it's occurred to me. I was going to say, well, what does that mean for cities? What does that mean for cities? And it occurred to me, well, if you went back 100 years, 120 years, that innovation economy was the industrial economy. So it was Detroit, or even all of these small towns in Massachusetts that have all these old mill buildings that are no longer in use. But that you would build a whole community around that
that's very interesting.
Economic activity.
And then you had to walk, so you built walkable communities.
And it was all your workers were within 5 minutes or 10 minutes.
We've actually come right back to that in many ways.
The
new economy now needs to be walkable again. And in fact, housing alone is not enough. It is making sure that you create it as a critical mass that creates 5-minute neighborhoods that attract folks to live, work, have creative collisions. But also, nothing correlates more with education than not wanting to live a car-dependent life. So while the good workers who were our grandparents probably walked to the mill or whatever because they had to. Today, their grandchildren want to be able to walk to what the mill has been turned into, which is a new high-tech startup, because that's a better life. It's a healthier life. It's a more real life to them.
I wonder if that means that the era of the automobile really was the 20th century, and if we go out 50 years from now, it'll be an era of a whatever, who knows.
We are also entering an era of profound mobility, I'll call it disruption, the advent of connected mobility and then autonomous mobility. The U.S. automobile fleet turns over every 15 years. So 15 years from now, the norm will not be cars as we know them. It'll be at least connected mobility. These are cars that drive 6 inches from each other because they just don't bump into each other. They can park much more compactly. That means that as we densify our urban cores, we can fit more and more parked cars into the spaces we already have. Connected vehicles can also communicate with us in ways that will make shared mobility a more convenient option for folks, so therefore they won't be parking, and the process will save a lot of money. Shared mobility can cut, the average American household spends probably, if you live in a suburb, you might spend 15% of your disposable income on mobility. If you live in a city, it's less than 10%. If you can rely on shared mobility, you can cut that to 5%.
Now, let me ask you though, but how does that, what you're saying now, play against this post-COVID notion that a lot of these areas still feel slightly hollowed out? So if you're in downtown Boston or you're in Harvard Square or you're anywhere, it's not quite as vibrant as you remember it.
Yeah, and that's true, and we're in a period of transition. We're going to come out of that with more housing within walking distance. What the pandemic really did, whether whoever developed COVID in a laboratory someplace, if that's how, really did for the rest of us is bring us a lot closer to our future. I think that's something you said right at the beginning. It was like the recession of 2007-8. Or 2008-9. It made a lot of changes in our society a lot more obvious. It's interesting. It was not in the collapse in housing prices in suburbs in 2008-9 versus the pretty much stable urban values that really opened people's eyes to where people wanted to live. They just didn't get it until then. There are many suburbs where housing values still haven't returned in real dollars to 2008 or 9. In most cities, they probably at least doubled.
Shall we begin?
So with connected mobility, we will be able to densify without paying, the premium of having to provide structured parking is going to begin to drop away as we reuse more and more parking. First of all, we can add an awful lot of housing to our downtowns that can park in the empty parking garages built for office that no longer needs those spaces. Right. That was very literally true for El Paso. When we looked at the potential housing demand for the next 20 years, you could pretty much satisfy that, build those units and satisfy their demand with empty office parking spaces, which meant you pulled about $30,000 or more dollars out of the cost of every housing unit you created. But when we arrived at the era of autonomous mobility, it in urban areas is not going to be Teslas. It's going to be shared, and they won't park because that's going to be much less expensive and ultimately much more convenient, which makes building parking structures a really lousy investment at this point in time, just as a little side note.
Are you saying at this point in time? So
at this point, because they're going to be increasingly outmoded. You're building an asset that is, you've got in downtowns, in urban areas, in walkable areas, you've got in most cities a supply of empty office parking spaces that can support the new generation of housing that's going to move in for quite some time. And let that ride as long as you can, because parking requirements are probably going to be dropping. Particularly as we get closer to that 15-year point when our fleet has really turned over. And then when we go beyond that, they'll plummet.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Yeah. What would you say, what's the level of awareness of that factoid?
The level of awareness is very interesting. When we work with developers who are doing, let's say, a 20-year build-out for a development, and there are one or two in Boston, but I can't mention them, they know perfectly well that they're going to have to show how they can park that development at current parking ratios, because you can't get approved.
I was going to say they're terrified of the community groups.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But they're locating those garages in ways that by year 10, 15, 20, they don't build them. The plan can move ahead. Because they are assuming that the garages they build in the first 5 to 10 years will support them through year 20.
Right. And meanwhile, the thinking will change and the awareness will change.
There are a lot of folks in the public sector who are perfectly aware of this, but everybody nods and agrees that we have to show something that would meet current standards just in case. Now comes a full stop. And you already asked me about this, but I'm just going to reiterate for our listeners that everything I said, taken literally and not managed in the right way, is very elitist. We have got to invest heavily in really robust workforce readiness and training programs. It turns out, this is very interesting, we learned this in New Orleans. I did the post-Katrina master plan for New Orleans, and equity is very important. It should be everywhere, but one of the things that was very clear, you could give people about 2 more years of education or really high, technical training and greatly increase their competitive position in the workforce, so that there are a lot of folks, if you don't have a high school degree, there are many more of you than there are jobs, even today. With that 2 more years, which is not that much, you reverse that, and there were more jobs than there were people looking for them. So it's the mountain is not that tall in terms of what we need to do to really empower people to participate in this economy. We also have to remember that, get back to your question about housing, we've got to create the affordable housing supply, not only because it's morally right and we all know it and share that as a value, I think certainly in our community, but because we need to attract folks who haven't saved enough money for big down payments or can't afford a lot of rent yet, because they're our economic future and we want them living in our city, in our cool, walkable downtown. And we got to find housing that's affordable.
This focus on urban, and I'm an urbanist, you're an urbanist.
Yeah.
Where does that leave us? Because we're at the macro level, we're at a point of at least feeling a great deal of instability across many, many sectors.
Yeah.
And yet you're talking about these trends that are just happening sort of underneath the radar. How do you see all that playing out?
I think this is an answer to your question. If it isn't, ask me the question again. But you reminded me of a project that I worked on in Sandy Springs, Georgia, which is just outside of Atlanta. It is the most politically conservative community I've ever worked in. To be a little bit direct, the night we were asked to do a plan to create a new downtown. Sandy Springs is in Fulton County. It was unincorporated. It had incorporated under the leadership of the woman who became their mayor, Eva Galambos, in part because affluent neighborhood was sending a lot of its tax dollars, it thought, to less affluent parts of Fulton County, to be blunt. So very politically conservative community. She felt they needed a heart to the community. They needed a downtown, so they hired us to create that. Lots of intensive conversations with folks about the kinds of densities you needed, and the word density ended the meeting quickly. It's what do you want in this downtown? What's missing in your life? What do you want to add? Walkable, heart, mixed use place that brings us together, et cetera. Well, these are the densities that will deliver it, and they're not going to spill into your neighborhoods. They're going to stay downtown. I get it. That's okay. All right. Not only did they choose to call it City Springs, which I found fascinating, but they used eminent domain to take some of the land necessary to create it. The point of all this is they chose to be pragmatic. And I think the place we all come together around is pragmatism. What is going to make our lives more livable, create more economic opportunity, create equity either because we believe in it or because we recognize that it's important to bring more folks into our economy and share the benefits we have. We don't have to agree on why, but being pragmatic tends to bring us together around the same policies for our communities.
Do you think these outcomes are we just on this track, or are these actively choices we're going to have to make along the way?
We're going to have to make, well, both, depending on our community, but we're going to have to make a lot of active choices. And in this, we now come to the talk. So if we're going to create a new paradigm, first we need leadership. Somebody needs to convene the community conversation. Then we have to have that talk, that conversation. This is Leesburg, Virginia, really believed in its historic legacy, really needed density to replace former shopping centers, et cetera, to create a new generation of walkable neighborhoods. They got that. They got it because we gave them a lot of the data that you and I have talked about. The changing demographics, the changing needs of our economy. They got the what me worry, Alfred E. Newman, was something they needed to think about. Their community was changing too. They needed to manage that change. We needed to have lots of meetings. We couldn't do this process at our pace. We had to do it at their pace. We had to answer their questions. We had to come to their neighborhoods to talk. But what happened was they began to they integrated this information into their understanding of their community and how the world works, and they made a different set of decisions that helped lay the stage for the kinds of upward growth that Leesburg needed. Not a single neighborhood, whether dated from the 1790s or the 1990s, needed to change, but the strip centers and old industrial sites and malls did need to, and in ways that created a 21st century generation of new neighborhoods that would attract the talent and the jobs, et cetera. So we've got process in place, leadership and conversation. Now we come to planning. And planning starts with, when people understand they need this density, making sure we achieve the critical mass. So if you're going to add a couple thousand housing units to downtown Memphis, make sure you do it within a 5-minute walk of Main Street in Memphis or another retail node that's emerging, so you get the benefit. Shape density of the task at hand. 30 to 40, maybe 30 to 50 units per acre, which looks like the examples on my slide here, will give you the support for retail on a walkable Main Street that you need, and probably the transit that you want. Manage impacts. Arlington, Virginia has done a great job of creating along Wilson Boulevard, a dense heart to our core corridor that follows Metro. It is full of walkable restaurants and all kinds of cool amenities that are supported by workers and the neighborhoods to each side. They have really planned well so traffic does not spill into nearby neighborhoods. Make sure we have the public-private partnerships that fund, I'll call it the infrastructure of walkability. When you're redeveloping a mall or transforming public housing into mixed-income housing as we are here, the sidewalks, the parks, the squares, the things that really make up a public realm that people want to come to aren't there. You've got to pay for those. Developer probably can't, and you may need to subsidize the development at first, in fact, but boy, are the dividends rich. Then we come to, what are the urban design principles that really matter?
Before you get onto that, just briefly, you've mentioned malls many times now. Do you think the suburban shopping mall is a bygone?
The suburban shopping mall is a bygone, which is why I'm working on 3 of them right now.
Is that because it's online retail?
Okay, it's because of online retail. It's because mass marketing depended on growth, and mass marketing depended on growth in middle class wealth. And wealth is not growing for the middle class. A great many of us earn less in real dollars than we did in 1970. A much smaller number of us who are well educated and being rewarded, given high salaries by our knowledge economy, earning a lot more. And knowledge and education tend to correlate with wanting to shop at cool small businesses, not mass retailers. Yes. I was asked recently by a CNN reporter if the departure of department stores from downtown San Francisco, lost a couple, got lots of publicity, mattered. It doesn't. They were doomed. Pandemic accelerated their death. It's the cool new retailers who are moving in because people are moving in and demand is moving in that are the future of our downtowns. So now some urban design principles. If we pay attention to walkability matters. Actually, this is Marshall's Plaza in Newton, where Northland has created this place. It created the density that will support walkability and the critical mass of housing. I think I mentioned earlier, around 1,000 units. It's springing to life. Connectivity, not only transit where we can, but also creating the kinds of places. This is in Sandy Springs. They created a performing arts center that holds performances that speak to actually not just everybody in Sandy Springs, but the full cross section of Fulton County and Atlanta. There is the black community, older white community, no matter who you are, Latino community, they come to Sandy Springs for things. And that means that City Springs, a wide variety of people call City Springs mine, because there's something there that's about them, not just can they get there. Okay. Public realm that is multi-layered. It has places that are quiet where a couple can have a conversation or a couple kids can play, and places that bring the full community together. And we need places where everybody can gather. This is actually really interesting. This is Railroad Park in Birmingham, Alabama. I had the honor, the opportunity to support it when I was on an Urban Land Institute panel looking at downtown many years ago. We said, yeah, it's a good idea. What it turned out to be was a great idea because it was consciously designed to bring black and white Birmingham, old and young Birmingham, gay and straight Birmingham, no matter how you looked at social and other divisions, together in one place. Right. And this is where actually affluent suburbs and poor urban neighborhoods, et cetera, come together to hold monthly potlucks. It is the heart of Birmingham as a community. And finally, authenticity. These are examples I both love. One is Water Street. I had a chance to plan. Actually, we finished it and we left. It was 5.5 million. Now 9 million square feet of new mixed-use walkable development in Tampa, giving Tampa a real ability to capture knowledge industry growth that it did not have. And the coolest thing in it, I think, is called Maker's Alley, because what the developer understood is that we could build the newest, coolest, most magnificent glass buildings anywhere, and somebody will spend $1 billion and build something even better. But if we bring the living culture, the authenticity of Tampa into our community, it will be new every day and therefore competitive. So that's what Maker's Alley is about. The image to the right is a parking garage at the edge of Belmar, a very cool community outside of Denver. It was surrounded by parking structures. People started to build housing near it because it was a great magnet. But wait a second, there's a wall of parking structures. They simply turned one aisle of parking facing the street into artists' workspaces. I think they spent more on banners than anything else, and the garage became a scene. It became, it has brought the living culture of Denver to the street and to people, and give everybody a face to the community. And finally, one of my favorite examples, and then I shall close, is Opelika, Florida, the probably poorest suburban community in Florida. Population is more than 90% black and Latino, most of that black. They wanted to bring their downtown back. Believe me, there was no market as such to do that. This is a very poor community. However, there were a series of barracks that had been owned by the Navy right next door to downtown. By turning those barrack sites into 2,000 plus units of mixed income housing, we were able to create the market that is now within its 5-10 minute walk of downtown. We have created a market that is now drawing investment back to that downtown. Density next to downtown is bringing downtown back. Without that density, no downtown. With that density, Opelika has a new heart. Thank you very much. Fundamental changes to our demographics, to our economy, to our climate, to our environment, to our mobility technology, the sort of perfect storm these are creating makes this a time when we have to be pragmatic. And I think communities, given the right chance for community conversation, choose pragmatism and make the kinds of choices I've just talked about.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you again for coming back on Unplugged.
Okay.
I know there's lots more to talk about, so maybe we can get you back.
Well, I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed the last time, and I never did talk about this.